Mara Vance slammed $3.18 onto the bar counter. That was it. Every coin she had in the world. Behind her a man laughed, not a kind laugh, but the kind that meant he wanted her to feel small. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the kind of rage that builds so slow and so quiet inside a woman that when it finally breaks, it breaks everything. She didn't look at the laughing man. She looked at the door. And she thought, if I walk out that door tonight, my brother will be dead by morning. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't you dare leave before the ending. You won't see it coming. The saloon in Red Hollow smelled like old whiskey and older sins. Mara Vance had worked there long enough to know every crack in the floorboards, every stain on the bar top, every man who came through that door, and what he wanted before he even opened his mouth. She knew which tables needed extra napkins and which ones needed her to move fast. She knew when to smile and when to keep her eyes down. She had learned the way women in desperate places always learn quietly, quickly, and without complaint. But tonight was different. Tonight the $3.18 sat on the bar like a verdict. She stared at them. Then she looked up at Morrison, her boss, a thick-necked man with a gray mustache and eyes the color of dirty water. "That's all I've got," she said. "That's tonight's take. All of it." Morrison didn't even look up from the ledger. "Don't matter what your take is, Mara. Your brother's tab at the doctor's office is $40. Week's end. $40. She repeated it like she'd never heard the number before, like it belonged to a different language. "Morrison, I've been working 6 nights a week since my father died. I haven't missed a single shift." "I know that." "I haven't asked for one single favor." "I know that too." He finally looked at her, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite pity, but was close enough to make her stomach turn. "But Dr. Hale says if Samuel doesn't get that treatment by week's end, the infection spreads to his lungs. After that..." He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need him to. "Give me an advance," she said. "Take it out of my wages." "Can't do it." "Morrison, I said I can't." He lowered his voice. "Girl, I got debts of my own. Railroad men coming through here 3 nights a week, running up tabs, breaking chairs. I've got a broken window out back that's been letting the cold in since November. I'm barely holding on myself." Mara pressed her palms flat against the bar. Breathed in. Breathed out. "Then I'll work more shifts." "There are no more shifts. The kitchen closes at midnight. The bar closes at 1. I can't keep the lights burning any later than that. Fire marshal's already on my back." She picked up the $3.18, folded the bills, tucked the coins into her apron pocket. The coins clinked softly against each other, a small and humiliating sound. "Fine," she said, and she walked back to the floor. The saloon was loud that night. It was always loud on Fridays when the railroad crews came in from whatever stretch of land they were tearing up, their hands rough and their moods rougher. They crowded the tables and hollered for drinks and told stories that got bigger with every round. Mara moved between them with the tray balanced on her forearm, her face smooth and unreadable, her mind somewhere far away. She was calculating. She was always calculating now. If she walked to the Hargrove farm before sunup and asked Mrs. Hargrove for laundry work that was maybe $2 by Tuesday. If she pawned her mother's brooch, the little silver one with the blue stone, that could be another $5. If she stretched it out, if she scraped together every last thing she had, and every last favor she could call in, hey. A hand closed around her wrist. She stopped. Jack Sterling looked up at her from his chair. He was a big man, railroad supervisor, or at least that's what he told people. He had pale blue eyes and a smile that never reached them, and he'd been drinking since before the sun went down. "You walk too fast," he said. "Makes a man feel ignored." Mara kept her voice level. "What can I get you, Mr. Sterling?" "Another whiskey." He didn't let go of her wrist. "And a little conversation." "I've got other tables. They'll wait." His grip tightened just slightly, not enough to hurt enough to make the point. "I heard about your brother." That's a real shame. Real shame. Boy, that young laid up sick. He tilted his head. $40 is an awful lot of money for a girl with empty pockets. Mara went very still. Let go of my wrist, Mr. Sterling. I'm just saying. He smiled. Man in my position, $40 is nothing, like throwing a penny in the well. Let go of my wrist. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed and released her. Touchy, he said. Just like your daddy was touchy. Right up until the end, I heard. The room didn't go quiet exactly, but the men closest to them stopped talking. A few looked over. Mara's jaw was tight. Her hands were steady. She'd trained herself over years to keep her hands steady. But something behind her eyes had shifted, had gone hot and bright and dangerous. My father, she said softly, was worth 10 of you, and I'll thank you not to speak his name. Sterling spread his hands in a false gesture of innocence. No offense meant. Just making conversation. Your whiskey will be right out. She turned away before he could say another word. She set the empty tray down at the bar and stood there for a moment with her back to the room. She pressed one hand flat against the bar top and breathed until the heat behind her eyes cooled back down into something manageable. Morrison had seen the whole thing. He didn't say anything. He never said anything. She picked up Sterling's whiskey and turned around. That was when she saw the man in the corner. He was sitting alone at the table, nearest the far wall, away from the noise and the light. He'd come in sometime in the last half hour. She must have missed him in the chaos of the Friday crowd, which almost never happened. Mara noticed everything. He was dressed simply. Dark vest, light shirt with the sleeves rolled part way up, a battered hat set on the table beside a nearly full glass of whiskey. He wasn't watching the room the way most men watched it, with hunger or boredom or a need to be seen. He was watching it the way a man watches something when he's trying to understand it. Quiet, methodical, patient, and right now he was watching her. Their eyes met for half a second. His were dark enough that she couldn't tell the color from across the room. He didn't look away, didn't smile, didn't give her anything to work with. Just looked at her with that same calm, steady attention, and then looked back down at his glass. Mara crossed the floor, delivered Sterling's whiskey without a word, and made her rounds. She stopped at the corner table last. You need anything else? She asked. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, somewhere in his early 30s. The kind of face that had spent a lot of time in weather-tanned skin, a few lines at the corners of his eyes. He had the hands of a man who worked. That surprised her. She'd taken him for a businessman. Something about the way he held himself. I'm fine, he said. His voice was low and unhurried. Thank you, ma'am. She started to move away. He gives you trouble often, he said. She turned back. Who? The loud one. The one who grabbed your wrist. Mara looked at him for a moment. That's none of your concern. Probably not. He didn't seem offended, just stated it the way you'd state a fact. Didn't look like the first time is all. It isn't. She didn't know why she said that. She didn't usually say things like that to strangers. But I handle it. I saw that. And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. You handle it well. She walked away before that shape could turn into anything that required a response. She didn't think about him again until closing time, when she was wiping down the bar and the last of the customers had filed out into the cold night air. Morrison was counting the till. The cook had already gone home. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. Mara was so tired her bones ached. Mara, she looked up. The man from the corner table was still there. He'd put his hat back on and was standing a few feet from the bar with his hands easy at his sides. He set something on the bar top. A coin. A silver dollar. She stared at it. For the whiskey, he said. Whiskey's 20 cents. I know. She didn't touch the coin. I don't take charity. It's not charity. He didn't seem bothered by her tone. It's a tip. There's a difference. A silver dollar for a glass of whiskey is charity with a different name. He looked at her steadily. You argued with a man twice your size tonight in front of a room full of people who weren't going to do a thing to help you, and you did it with your voice level and your hands steady. That's not a 20-cent service. That's something rarer. He touched the brim of his hat. Good night, ma'am. He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. Mara stood there. She looked at the silver dollar. She picked it up. The weight of it sat in her palm like a small, complicated promise. Morrison looked over. Who was that? I don't know, she said. And that was the truth. But she found out the next morning the way you found out most things in Red Hollow from Mrs. Patton at the general store, who knew everything about everybody, and was constitutionally incapable of keeping it to herself. Calder Rourke, Mrs. Patton said, wrapping Mara's bread and not even pretending she wasn't about to deliver news. Came into town yesterday evening. You know the name. Should I? His father is Edmund Rourke, the Rourke family Mara. They own half the mining operations east of the canyon. They own Silver Creek. She paused to let that land. Edmund Rourke's been mostly absent for years, health problems, they say. The son's been managing things, but there's talk he's out here looking at land, thinking about something new. Mara set her coins on the counter. Thank you, Mrs. Patton. She walked back to the boarding house where she and Samuel shared 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. The floorboards creaked under her feet. The smell of the place old wood and lye soap and something medicinal closed around her the moment she opened the door. Samuel was awake. He was always awake early because lying down made the coughing worse, so he sat propped against the headboard with a blanket over his shoulders and a book open in his lap that she suspected he wasn't really reading. He was 17 years old, and he looked younger the way sickness made young people look thin and somehow transparent, like you could see right through to something fragile underneath. You're up early, he said. Had errands. She set the bread on the small table and pulled her chair close to the bed. How was the night? Fine. He said it the way he always said it, quick and light, because he knew she was counting the coughs, the fevers, the bad nights, and he didn't like being counted. The doctor came by, said I needed that treatment by Friday. I know. Mara. His voice changed. I don't want you to do anything you... Samuel. She said it the way their mother used to say it, quietly. Finally, the word that meant the conversation was over before it began. Don't. He closed his book, looked at her. There was something in his eyes too old for his age, something that had gotten there faster than it should have because of what their family had been through, the debt, the death, the years of barely enough. How much do you have? He asked. Enough, she said. It was not the truth, but it was what she had. She spent the morning doing laundry for Mrs. Hargrove, hauling water-scrubbing linens, hanging them in the cold air until her fingers went numb. She earned $1.75 and a kind word, which was better than some days. She spent the afternoon mending shirts for Mr. Albright at the tailor's shop. 4 shirts, careful stitching, 30 cents each. She walked home in the early dark with her back aching and her hands raw and her mind doing the same arithmetic it had been doing for months, trying to make numbers add up that simply did not add up, no matter how many times she ran them. She was almost to the boarding house when she heard her name. Miss Vance. She turned. Calder Rourke was standing a few feet away on the boardwalk. He was alone. In the pale afternoon light, he looked less like a mystery and more like a man tired around the edges, something behind his eyes that might have been trouble or might have been thought. It was hard to tell the difference sometimes. Mr. Rourke, she said. You know my name. This is a small town. He nodded. I wondered if I might speak with you. Won't take long. I'm not interested in whatever you're selling. I'm not selling anything. He said it simply without defensiveness. I saw something last night that I haven't been able to put down. The situation with your brother, I heard some of it from Sterling. Didn't like how he used it. Mr. Rourke, I have resources, he said. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm not asking you to like me. But $40 is not an insurmountable problem for a man in my position, and it sounds like it's a very insurmountable problem for you. I want to help. Mara looked at him for a long time, The cold moved between them. A wagon clattered past on the frozen road. "Why?" she said. He didn't answer right away, which she respected more than if he'd had the answer ready. He seemed to be thinking about whether the true answer was one he wanted to say out loud. "Because I've seen a lot of places like this one," he said finally. "And I've seen a lot of men like Sterling. And I don't usually do anything about it. I'd like to this once do something about it." "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing. Men don't give $40 for nothing. Maybe not." He held her gaze. "But I'm offering it anyway." Mara thought about Samuel's eyes in the lamplight that morning. Too old, too knowing. She thought about the way the coughing sounded through the thin wall between their rooms, and how she lay there in the dark, listening to it counting each one like a countdown she didn't want to reach the end of. "I don't take charity," she said. "I remember. If you want to do something," she said slowly, "then give me a way to earn it. Not a gift. Not a loan you'll pretend wasn't a loan. Work. Real work with fair wages. Do you have that kind of thing, Mr. Rourke?" He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to be a question. Then something settled in his face. Decided, resolved, as if she'd just answered something he'd been trying to figure out. "I might," he said. "Come by the livery at 9 tomorrow morning. We'll talk." She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She walked the rest of the way home in the dark and stood outside Samuel's door for a moment, listening to the silence from inside. And then she went to bed and lay awake until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, asking herself what kind of woman walked into a meeting with a stranger who could either save everything she had or take the last of it. By 4 o'clock she had her answer. The same kind of woman who worked 2 jobs and counted coins and stood up to Jack Sterling in a room full of men who weren't going to help her. The kind who didn't have the luxury of saying no to something that might be a door opening in a wall that had been solid for too long. She was at the livery at 8:55. Calder was already there. He had a map spread out on a workbench and a cup of coffee going cold beside it, and when she walked in, he didn't make a fuss of her being early or seem surprised by it. He just moved slightly to give her room to see the map. 5,000 acres, he said. East of the canyon, north of the creek. Good land. I've been looking at it for 2 years. What kind of operation? Ranch. Cattle eventually. Maybe some crops. I haven't decided on all of it yet. He glanced at her. I need someone who can manage books, handle payroll, deal with suppliers. Someone who knows numbers and isn't afraid to argue when the numbers are wrong. Mara looked at the map. Her father had taught her bookkeeping on his knee in the years before the mine, when he'd believed that giving her something useful was the best thing a father could do. She'd kept the saloon's books for Morrison for 2 years now. Not that he paid her for it, just expected it lumped it in with everything else she did for the same flat weekly wage. What are the terms? She asked. Hourly wage. Fair one. Housing for you and your brother on the property once we're established. Medical care included. He paused. Samuel's treatment covered immediately before you set foot on that land. She looked up from the map. Before, he said again. Not conditional. Not something you have to earn. Because the alternative is that you spend the next 6 days trying to pull $40 out of thin air, and that helps nobody. Mara was quiet for a long moment. You don't know me, she said. You don't know if I'm honest. You don't know if I can actually do what you need. I watched you last night, he said. I've learned to read people. It's a skill you pick up when your life has depended on reading them correctly. He paused. You're honest, and you can do it. What if I can't? Then I find someone else, and you're no worse off than you are right now. He said it without cruelty, just plainly the way you said something that was simply true. But I don't think that's how it goes. Mara pulled her coat a little tighter. Outside, Red Hollow was waking up. She could hear it. The early sounds of wagons and voices, and the ordinary machinery of a small town getting on with its day. Samuel was still upstairs in the boarding house, propped against his headboard, counting the hours. I want a contract, she said. Written. Terms clear. If anything about this arrangement changes without my agreement, I walk. No argument. Calder looked at her steadily. Agreed. Fair wages. In writing. Agreed. Samuel's treatment confirmed by Dr. Hale before I sign anything. I'll go with you to his office this afternoon. Mara looked at the map one more time. At the 5,000 acres drawn in simple lines, this piece of country that didn't yet know it was about to have something built on it. She thought about all the times she'd looked at her own life and seen only the edges of things, the edge of enough money, the edge of enough time, the edge of hope that hadn't quite given out. All right, she said. We'll go see Dr. Hale. She reached out and put her hand on the edge of the map, not quite a handshake, but something. A marker. A place to start. Calder Rourke looked at her hand and then at her face, and what she saw in his expression was not triumph or satisfaction, but something quieter and more complicated. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, a great deal like relief. She didn't know what to make of that yet. She filed it away with all the other things she didn't know what to make of yet in the place she kept things that required more information before she could decide what they meant. Right now, she had $40 worth of trouble to fix and a brother who needed her. Everything else could wait. Dr. Hale's office smelled like camphor and something medicinal that Mara had never been able to name. She'd been in this room more times than she could count in the past 4 months, standing in the same spot just inside the door while the doctor spoke in his careful, measured voice about Samuel's condition, the infection, the progression, the treatments that were possible but not free, never free. This time was different. This time Calder Rourke stood beside her. Dr. Hale was a small man, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of steady hands that made you trust him, even when what he was saying was the last thing you wanted to hear. He looked at Mara first the way he always did, and then at Calder with the particular look a small-town doctor gives a stranger, not hostile, but measuring. "Mr. Rourke says he's covering Samuel's treatment," Mara said. "I need to hear it confirmed. Terms, timeline, all of it." "That's correct," Calder said. He had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. "Whatever Samuel needs, starting today." Dr. Hale looked at him over the top of his glasses. "That's a significant commitment for a man who arrived in this town 48 hours ago." "I'm aware of that. Samuel Vance needs a course of treatment that runs 6 weeks minimum. After that, if the infection is responding, we continue. If it isn't..." He stopped. Looked at Mara. "It's not a guarantee. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "The total cost 6 weeks is closer to $90, not 40. Mara went very still. She hadn't known that. The number sat in the air between them like something with weight. "90, Calder said. "All right." "Just like that," Dr. Hale said. "Just like that." Calder looked at Mara. "I told you not conditional, not something to earn. Samuel gets what he needs." Mara's jaw was tight. She was not going to let herself feel grateful yet. Gratitude had a way of making you soft in places you couldn't afford to be soft, and she had a contract to negotiate and a brother upstairs who needed her thinking clearly. "Then we go upstairs," she said. "I want Samuel to hear it from you directly." Samuel was sitting up when they came in, which was better than some days. He looked at Calder the way 17-year-olds looked at grown men who showed up unexpectedly with their sister, a look that was equal parts suspicion and assessment, and considerably sharper than most people expected from a boy his age. "This is Calder Rourke," Mara said. "He's going to pay for your treatment." Samuel blinked, looked at Calder, looked at Mara. "Why?" "Because he's offering me a job," Mara said. "A real one, and the treatment is part of the terms." "What kind of job?" "Ranch work, books, payroll operations." Samuel was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved back to Calder, steady and unhurried. "You own a ranch." "I'm building one," Calder said. 5,000 acres east of the canyon. It'll take time to get established. And you need my sister to run the numbers. Among other things, she's been running Morrison's numbers for 2 years, Samuel said. He doesn't pay her for it. "Samuel?" Mara said. "It's true." He looked at Calder without flinching. She does 3 people's work for 1 person's wage, and she doesn't complain because she thinks complaining is a waste of energy. If you take that for granted, she'll walk. And she should. Calder held the boy's gaze. I know what I'm asking her to do and what it's worth, he said. The wage will reflect that. Samuel seemed to turn this over, examining it from a few different angles, the way he examined most things. Then he settled back against his pillow, with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve himself. All right, he said. Not to Calder, to Mara. All right. She reached out and pressed his hand once brief and firm, and then let go before it could become something sentimental. Dr. Hale will be up this afternoon, she said. You'll start the treatment today. They drew up the contract that evening at the livery, Mara seated on a barrel, with the document on a plank across her knees, reading every line twice. She crossed out 2 clauses that she didn't like and added 3 of her own. Calder read her additions without comment, picked up the pen and signed. No negotiation, no resistance. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. She just signed her own name and folded her copy into her coat pocket and stood up. When do we start? She asked. I'll ride out to the land Monday morning, he said. There's a crew coming from Abilene to begin clearing. I'd like you there for the initial survey. We'll need to establish the boundaries before we start talking to suppliers. I'll be there. He nodded, reached out his hand. She shook it, a clean, businesslike grip, the kind that didn't linger. She was almost to the door when he said, Miss Vance. She turned. Thank you, he said, for giving this a chance. It was a strange thing for him to say. She was the one who needed the job. She was the one whose brother was sick. She was the one with $3.18 to her name as of yesterday morning. And yet he said thank you, as if she were doing him the favor. She thought about that the whole walk home, and still hadn't decided what to make of it by the time she climbed into bed. Monday came cold and clear, the kind of early spring morning that couldn't make up its mind whether it was still winter. Mara rode out to the canyon on the old mare she'd borrowed from Mrs. Hargrove in exchange for 2 weeks of laundry. The land opened up east of town in a way that Red Hollow itself never did, big and unfinished, and full of the kind of silence that didn't feel empty so much as waiting. Calder was already there with 3 men from the crew standing around a surveyor's post that had been driven into the frozen ground. He introduced her to the foreman, a weathered man named Pete Calloway, who shook her hand with the brief efficiency of someone who'd been told she'd be there, and had decided to take that at face value. The other 2 men were less neutral. She could see it in the way they looked at her, not hostility exactly, but the particular skepticism that men in physical work sometimes carried for anyone they suspected of not being able to keep up. She let them look. She got out her ledger and her pencil, and she got to work. By noon, she had a preliminary materials list, a projected timeline for the first phase of construction, and 3 separate conversations with suppliers that Calder had set up in advance. All of them conducted by her at Calder's direction, because he said flatly that she knew the numbers better than he did, and there was no sense in him doing the talking. The first supplier, a man named Greer, who sold lumber out of a yard in Ridgeway, took one look at her and said, I'd prefer to discuss this with Mr. Rourke directly if you don't mind. Mr. Rourke doesn't mind, Calder said from behind her. But I'm not the one you're negotiating with. Miss Vance handles all purchasing decisions. Greer looked uncertain. Is that so? It is, Mara said pleasantly. And the price you've quoted me is 14% higher than your competitor in Dalton. So unless you'd like to revisit that number, I'll be taking our order down the road. Greer revised his number. Mara accepted it, wrote it down, and moved on. Calloway caught up with her at the end of the day while she was finishing her notes. He stood a few feet away with his hat in his hands, which she was starting to understand was how men in the West signaled that they were about to say something they weren't entirely sure you wanted to hear. Miss Vance, he said, I owe you an apology. She looked up from her ledger. For what? I figured you for Morrison's girl. He said it plainly without excuse. Figured Rourke had brought you out here for something other than the work. I was wrong, and I want to say so. Mara regarded him for a moment. Calloway was 50 or thereabouts, with the particular dignity of a man who had spent his life doing hard things. She'd seen him watch her all morning without any obvious conclusion on his face, which she respected more than if he'd smiled too easily. "Apology accepted," she said. "Now about the crew scheduling, I want to look at the rotation." Over the next 2 weeks, she fell into a rhythm she hadn't expected. She rode out each morning before full light, worked through the day, alongside the crew, rode back to Red Hollow in the evening to check on Samuel and run whatever errands needed running. The work was harder than anything she'd done before, but harder in a way that made sense, complicated and physical, and full of problems that had solutions if you were willing to think them through. She and Calder talked a lot during those 2 weeks. Not about personal things, at least not directly. They talked about the land, the build, the crew, the suppliers, the 100 decisions that needed making every single day. But in the course of all that talking, things got said that weren't strictly about business. Opinions, observations, the kind of small disclosures that happen between people who spend long days working toward the same thing. She learned that he'd been west of the Mississippi for most of the past decade, that he'd worked for a time as a federal investigator, something to do with land fraud, railroad acquisition schemes before his father's health had required him to take on more of the family's operations. He said that last part carefully, in a way that made her hear what he wasn't saying, that taking on the family's operations had not been something he'd wanted. She didn't ask him to say more. She understood the particular weight of being the person a family depended on, whether you'd chosen it or not. "How long were you with the Federal Service?" she asked one afternoon. They were going over timber calculations side by side, her ledger open between them on the back of a supply wagon. 7 years. "What made you leave?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father asked me to come back. Said he needed someone he could trust." He paused. "I'm not sure I was the right person for what he needed, but I was the only person he asked." "That's a hard thing," she said. "It is." He looked at her. "What about your father? You haven't talked about him much." The question was quiet and without pressure, and that was the only reason she answered it. "He was a miner," she said. "Silver Creek." She kept her voice even the way she always kept her voice even when she said this. "There was a collapse 4 years ago. He was one of 11 men who didn't come out." Calder was still. "I'm sorry." "He was a good man," she said. "Careful. Smart. He didn't take chances underground that he didn't have to take, which is why—" She stopped. "Which is why," she looked at her ledger instead of at him. "Which is why we always wondered if the collapse was what they said it was, a structural failure, or something else." The words sat between them in the cold air. Calder didn't respond immediately, and when she finally looked at him, she couldn't read his expression. It had gone to that careful neutrality she was starting to recognize as the face he wore when he was thinking something he wasn't ready to say yet. "Was there an inquiry?" he asked. "There was something they called an inquiry," she said. "It lasted 3 days. The mining company brought in their own men to look at the site. They concluded it was a structural failure isolated incident, nobody's fault." She paused. "The families were given $200 each and asked to sign papers saying they accepted that conclusion." "Did you sign?" "My mother was still alive then. She was sick and we had nothing, and $200 was $200. She closed the ledger with a precise click. She signed. I was 15. I watched her sign. I have thought about that moment every single day since." Calder was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful. "Mara, there's something I need to tell you." She went still at his use of her first name. He'd called her Miss Vance every single day for 2 weeks. She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching, and what she saw in his face was not the expression of a man about to say something easy. "Silver Creek Mine," he said. "My family owns it." The sound of the crew working at the far end of the site seemed very far away suddenly. The cold came in sharper, or maybe she just felt it more. She looked at Calder Rourke and understood in one sudden awful lurch of clarity what she was looking at. "Your family," she said. "My father." He held her gaze. Edmund Rourke. He acquired Silver Creek in 1878. I didn't know the extent of it until recently, when I started going through the company records after he got sick. His voice was quiet and even, and she couldn't find a lie in it, which made everything worse somehow. There were things in those records that I needed to understand before I could decide what to do about them. I've been trying to understand them for the past year. Mara stood up. She wasn't aware of deciding to stand. She was just standing, the ledger in her hands, the late afternoon light very clear and very cold around them. "What kind of things?" she said. Her voice came out flat and controlled, and nothing like what was happening inside her chest. Inspections that should have flagged the structural problems at Silver Creek. Reports that were suppressed. A collapse that may not have been as unavoidable as the company claimed. He paused. "I don't have all of it yet, but I have enough to know that the inquiry was not what it should have been." Mara looked at him, at this man who had paid for Samuel's treatment and drawn up a fair contract and said thank you, like she was doing him a favor, and who was she now? Understood the son of the man whose decisions had put her father under the ground. She set the ledger down on the wagon. She picked up her coat. She started walking toward where the mare was tied. "Mara?" "Don't," she said. She didn't stop walking. "Not right now, don't." She untied the mare and swung up into the saddle and rode back toward Red Hollow in the last of the daylight, with the wind in her face and something burning at the back of her throat that was not quite crying and not quite rage, but lived somewhere in the narrow, airless space between the two. She had given this man her trust. Not all of it. She'd held some back, the way she always held some back, the way you learned to when you'd been let down enough times. But she had given him something real, something that had cost her. And now she was riding away from 5,000 acres of land, and a contract, and a salary, and Samuel's medical care, and the man who stood at the center of all of it was the son of the man who had taken her father from her. She didn't know yet what she was going to do. She only knew that Red Hollow was ahead of her in the dark, and Samuel was there, and that was enough of a direction for tonight. The rest of it would have to wait until she could breathe again. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the boarding house and listened to the silence from Samuel's room and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel finally the full weight of what had happened. Not the managed version of it, the one she kept in the front of her mind, where she could watch it and control it. The real version. The one that lived underneath everything else. Her father's name was Thomas Vance. He had been 41 years old when he died. He had big hands and a quiet laugh, and he used to whistle while he worked an old hymn tune that she could still hear sometimes when the house was very still. He had taught her to read a ledger and to ride a horse and to stand up straight when men tried to make her feel small. He had gone underground on a Tuesday morning in October with 10 other men, and none of them had come back up, and the company had spent 3 days deciding it was nobody's fault, and her mother had signed a paper saying she agreed, and 2 years later, her mother was gone, too worn through by grief and the illness that came after it, and Mara had been 17 years old with a 15-year-old brother and a box of her father's things and nothing else, and now she knew. The inquiry had been a performance. The records had said something different. There had been inspections that flagged the problems reports that disappeared a collapse that the company had seen coming and chosen to ignore. Edmund Rourke. A name she had heard before, the way you heard names in mining country at a distance attached to operations and acquisitions, and the kind of decisions that got made in offices far from the actual ground. She had never connected that name to Silver Creek specifically. She had never had a reason to. She had a reason now. By 3 in the morning, she had made her decision. By 4, she had unmade it. By 5, she was dressed and sitting at the small table with her contract in front of her, reading it again for the 4th or 5th time, looking for the thing that would tell her what to do. The contract was clean. The terms were exactly what she'd demanded. Samuel's medical care, unconditional. Fair wages. Her right to leave without argument if the terms changed. Calder's signature clear and unhesitating at the bottom of the page. She thought about the way he had told her. Not when she'd found out some other way, not from Sterling's mouth, not from Mrs. Patton, not from a piece of gossip that ambushed her when she wasn't ready. He had told her himself. He had looked at her and said there was something he needed to tell her, and then said it plainly without dressing it up. He'd sat with the discomfort of her reaction instead of defending himself or explaining it away. That meant something. She wasn't sure yet how much, but it meant something. Samuel was awake when she knocked. She'd known he would be. He slept badly most nights, and he always knew when she was up, even through the wall, the way siblings who'd been through hard things together developed a kind of low-frequency awareness of each other. "How bad is it?" he asked. She told him. All of it. She sat in the chair beside his bed and laid it out plainly, the way she did everything the mine, the record's Edmund Rourke Calder's admission. Samuel listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd always loved about him. He had their father's stillness when it mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I don't know." "That's not like you. I know." She folded the contract, unfolded it. "I've been going back and forth all night. If I walk away, we're back to $3.18 and your treatment stops. If you stay, you're working for the son of the man who—" "I know what it means, Samuel." He looked at her carefully. "Do you think he knew? Before he told you?" "He said he found out when he started going through the records, after his father got sick." "Do you believe him?" She thought about Calder's face. The particular quality of his stillness when he'd said the words. The fact that he hadn't tried to soften it, or justify it, or explain it into something more comfortable. "I think I do," she said. "I hate that I think I do." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Papa would say that a man is not the same thing as his father. Papa also would have said that a man is responsible for what his family does in his name. Both of those things can be true." Mara looked at her brother, at his thin shoulders, and his careful eyes, and the careful way he held himself to keep the coughing at bay. She thought about the 6 weeks of treatment that had already been paid for sitting in Dr. Hale's account like a fact she hadn't asked for but couldn't give back. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll figure it out." She was at the livery at 7 in the morning, earlier than she'd said she would come. She hadn't decided to go there. She'd just found herself walking in that direction with her coat buttoned against the cold and the contract in her pocket. Calder was there. He was sitting on a crate near the door with a cup of coffee in both hands and the look of a man who had not slept either. He stood when he saw her. "You came back," he said. "Don't read too much into it." She stopped a few feet away. "I have questions." "Ask them." "The records you found, what exactly do they say?" He didn't hesitate. There were 3 separate inspections of the Silver Creek shaft in the 18 months before the collapse. All 3 cited structural instability in the eastern tunnel system. All 3 were marked, reviewed, and filed. None of them resulted in any action. He paused. "There's also correspondence between my father's operations manager and the inquiry board. 2 of the 3 men on that board had prior business relationships with my father's company." Mara felt the information land in her chest like something physical. She'd known in the way you knew things you couldn't prove that the inquiry had been compromised. Knowing it and having it said out loud in plain language were different things. "Is that all of it?" she asked. "There's more," he said. "But I want to be careful about what I tell you and when. Not because I'm hiding it, because some of it I'm still working to verify, and I don't want to give you something half-confirmed. What are you planning to do with it?" "I'm planning to take it to the Federal Land Office in Abilene. There's a process for reopening inquiries when new evidence comes forward. It's slow, and it's not guaranteed, but it exists." He looked at her steadily. "I've already been in contact with an investigator I worked with during my time in the service. He's willing to look at it." "And your father?" Something crossed Calder's face, not quite pain, but the older cousin of it. "My father is dying," he said. "He has maybe 6 months. I'm not doing this to punish him. I'm doing it because 11 families have been living with a lie for 4 years, and that's—" He stopped. Started again. "That's not something I'm willing to let stand because it's inconvenient for my family's name." Mara studied him. She was good at reading people. She'd had to be years of watching faces across a bar top for the warning signs that tells the small shifts that told you when something was about to go wrong. She looked at Calder Rourke now and tried to find the place where the performance was the seam between what he was saying and what he actually meant. She didn't find it. "You should have told me at the beginning," she said. "Yes." "Before I signed anything." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I didn't know how to tell you something that I was still trying to understand myself. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth." "Why tell me at all?" "You could have let me go on not knowing." "No," he said. "I couldn't." The word was simple and final, and she believed it, which made her angrier somehow than if she hadn't. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because I've forgiven anything. Not because we're all right. Because there is a 6-week treatment sitting in Dr. Hale's account with Samuel's name on it. And because I have a signed contract with terms that are fair, and because—" She stopped. Breathed. "Because if you're telling the truth about going to the federal office, then I want to be close enough to know what happens. I want to know everything that comes out of those records. Do you understand?" "Yes," he said. "You'll know everything. And if I find out you've held anything back, you'll walk, I know." He paused. "I won't hold anything back." She pulled her ledger out from under her arm. "Then we have a materials delivery coming Friday that I need to reschedule because the timeline Calloway set up doesn't account for the ground freeze. We're going to lose a week on the foundation if we don't adjust." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "All right," he said. "Let's look at the timeline." They worked through it side by side, and the work was the same as it had been before, which was strange and also not strange because Mara had learned a long time ago that grief and anger and betrayal didn't stop the practical world from needing practical things. The supply order still needed rescheduling. The crew still needed their wages calculated. The timber delivery from Greer still needed confirming. She did all of it. And she watched Calder the way she'd watched rooms full of men for years looking for the thing that would tell her she'd made the wrong call. What she saw instead was a man who worked, who showed up before anyone else and stayed after the crew left, who listened when she corrected him, which she did twice that first week back, and who didn't make a fuss about it either time, who talked to the crew without condescension, and to the suppliers without theater, who, when Pete Calloway asked him directly about the ownership structure of the operation and whether the ranch would be tied to the Rourke mining interests, said no flatly, and without hesitation, that this was a separate enterprise, independently financed with no connection to Edmund Rourke's holdings. Calloway had looked at Mara after that. She'd given him a small nod. He'd nodded back and gotten on with his work. It was Sterling who brought things to a head. She should have expected it. Sterling had been watching the operation from the edges of town, with the particular attention of a man who felt personally offended by something he hadn't been invited to, and Red Hollow was small enough that everyone knew what everyone else was building. He came to the site on a Thursday morning, rode up on a gray horse with 2 men from the railroad crew flanking him. Mara saw him coming and kept writing in her ledger. Calder was at the far end of the site with Calloway looking at the foundation posts. The crew slowed and then stopped. Sterling pulled up and looked around at the operation with an expression of exaggerated surprise. "Well," he said, "this is something." He looked down at Mara. "Didn't know you'd moved up in the world, Mara. From serving whiskey to what exactly is it you're doing out here?" She didn't look up from the ledger. "Managing the operation, Mr. Sterling." "Is that right?" He looked around at the crew. "And these boys take orders from a saloon girl." "They take orders from whoever's running the books," Calloway said from somewhere behind Mara. "Which is her." Sterling looked at Calloway with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked back at Mara. "I heard something interesting. I heard the Rourke boys been making inquiries about Silver Creek. Old records, old reports." He kept his voice light, conversational. "I thought you might want to know that certain people consider that a very unwise line of inquiry." Now Mara looked up. "Is that a threat, Mr. Sterling?" "It's information." He smiled. "Freely given." "Who asked you to deliver it?" "Nobody asked me anything. I'm being neighborly." Calder was there now, having crossed the site with the particular quiet speed of a man who had covered ground under difficult conditions before. He stood beside Mara without looking at Sterling, just for a moment, establishing something. Then he looked up at the man on the gray horse. "Sterling," he said, "you're on private land." "I didn't see a fence." "You'll see one soon enough. In the meantime," he said it without raising his voice, without any particular threat in his tone, just a man stating a plain fact. "I'd encourage you to move along." Sterling looked at him for a long moment. The two men flanking him shifted slightly. Mara's hand was still on her ledger, but she was watching Sterling's face, reading the calculation happening behind those pale blue eyes. He was deciding whether this was worth it, whether the men behind him were enough, whether Calder Rourke was the kind of man you pushed or the kind you didn't. Sterling was good at reading men, which was the only thing she'd give him credit for. He pulled his horse around. "Like I said," he called back over his shoulder. "Neighborly information." He rode out. His men followed. The crew went back to work. Calder stood where he was for a moment, watching them go. Then he turned to Mara. "How much of that was about the records?" "All of it," she said. "He wouldn't come out here for any other reason. He's connected to someone who doesn't want those files opened." "Who?" She looked at him steadily. "That's what we need to find out." It was the first time she'd said "we." She heard it as she said it, and she saw him hear it too, the slight shift in his expression, careful and quiet. She didn't take it back. She'd meant it. That evening she stayed later than usual after the crew had gone and Calloway had ridden back to town. She and Calder sat on the back of the supply wagon with the last of the light going orange and flat across the land, going through the week's accounts. At some point the accounts were finished, and they were just sitting there, and neither of them moved to leave. "My investigator is coming to Abilene next week," Calder said. "His name is Dowd. He's thorough. He's going to want to talk to you. About my father. About what you know. What your mother was told when she signed those papers. The specifics of the inquiry." He paused. "You don't have to do it if you don't want to." Mara looked out at the 5,000 acres going dark around them, at the framework of something being built on ground that had never had anything built on it before. "I've been waiting 4 years for someone to ask me those questions," she said. "I'll talk to him." Calder nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father taught you the bookkeeping." "When I was 8, she said. "He said it was the most honest skill he knew. Numbers don't lie. People lie about numbers, but the numbers themselves, they just sit there and tell you the truth. He sounds like a man worth knowing." Mara's throat tightened just slightly, just for a moment. She kept her voice even. "He was," she said. "He was the best man I knew." The dark came in the way it did in open country, all at once and completely. They rode back to Red Hollow side by side without talking much, and the silence was different from what it had been before. Not careful, not negotiated. Just two people who had said what needed saying and were moving forward. She didn't trust Calder Rourke. Not entirely. Not yet. But she understood him better than she had a week ago, and understanding was how trust started in her experience, when it started at all. And somewhere in the land records, and the suppressed reports, and the inquiries that hadn't been inquiries at all, her father's name was written. She was going to find it. She was going to put it where it belonged, whatever it took. Martin Dowd arrived in Abilene on a Wednesday, which was the same day the first serious problem with the ranch hit Mara's ledger like a thrown stone. She found it in the supplier accounts, a discrepancy between what Greer had invoiced and what had actually been delivered to the site. 40 board feet of timber signed for by someone on the crew never appeared in the materials log. It wasn't the money that bothered her, though. 40 board feet wasn't nothing. It was the signature. She didn't recognize it. She brought it to Calloway that morning, spreading the invoice on the wagon bed between them. "Who signed this?" Calloway looked at it. His jaw tightened slightly. "That's Hicks. He's been with the crew 3 weeks. Where did he come from?" "Came in with the Abilene group. Seemed solid enough." "Pull his hiring papers," she said, "and find out where that timber went." She didn't wait for Calloway to finish before she saddled up and rode the 2 hours to Abilene, because she was already going to meet Dowd, and because some things needed to be handled in person. The discrepancy sat in the back of her mind the whole ride, quiet and insistent, the way financial irregularities always nagged at her, not loud but constant, like a door that wouldn't quite latch. Dowd was waiting at the hotel. He was a compact man in his 50s, with a short gray beard and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where talking too much was a liability. He stood when she came in and shook her hand with a direct, unhurried grip. Calder made the introduction. Mara Vance. She manages all operations at the ranch. She also has first-hand knowledge of the inquiry. Miss Vance. Dowd gestured to the chair across from him. Tell me what you remember. She told him. She had told the story to herself so many times over 4 years that it had a shape to it, a sequence, every detail in its place. The morning her father left for the shift. The sound of the wagon that brought the news. The 3 days of the inquiry, which she and her mother had attended every session of sitting in the back of the courthouse in their good clothes, listening to men in suits explain what had happened to their family in language so careful and so managed. It barely felt like it was about her father at all. The man who ran the inquiry, she said. His name was Aldous Frick. He was introduced as an independent safety assessor. But 2 weeks after the inquiry closed, I saw his name in the newspaper. He'd been appointed to the board of a mining company in Nevada. The appointment was signed by Edmund Rourke. Dowd wrote this down without any visible reaction. You remembered the name after 2 weeks. I remember every name from that inquiry, she said. Every face, every word. She paused. My mother forgot eventually. The grief got too heavy, and she let some of it go. I decided not to. Dowd looked at her for a moment, with the assessing gaze of a man who dealt professionally in the reliability of human memory. The appointment, he said. Do you know which paper? The Abilene Chronicle, October edition, 1879. She reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of newsprint, worn soft at the creases. She set it on the table between them. Dowd unfolded it carefully. Read it. Looked at Calder. You have the inspection reports. In Abilene, Calder said. I rode them here last week. They're with the land office clerk. I filed them formally under seal. Good. Dowd refolded the clipping and set it back on the table in front of Mara. Keep this. Don't give it to anyone else. He leaned back. I need to be honest with you both. Reopening a 4-year-old inquiry is not a fast process. The federal office will review the evidence, determine whether there's sufficient cause, and if they decide there is, they'll appoint an investigator. That takes time. Months, possibly longer. I've waited 4 years, Mara said. I can wait longer. There's also the question of exposure, Dowd said. Once this moves formally, certain people are going to know it's moving. If Sterling's visit to your site was connected to someone watching the Rourke records, then filing a formal complaint accelerates their awareness. He looked at Mara. That may create pressure on the operation. On you personally. What kind of pressure? The kind that has historically been applied to people who inconvenience powerful men, he said plainly. I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because you need to make an informed decision about whether to proceed. Mara looked at the folded newspaper clipping on the table. At her father's name, which wasn't in the article, he was just one of 11 men who hadn't come back up. But he was the reason she'd saved it. File it, she said. Dowd nodded. I'll be in contact with the federal office this week. She rode back to Red Hollow that afternoon with Calder beside her, and they didn't talk for the first hour. The land was wide and flat in the late winter light, and the horses moved steadily through it. She was thinking about Dowd's word pressure and what shape that pressure might take when it arrived. I want to tell you something, Calder said when they were about halfway back. She looked at him. After we file, if this goes the way I think it might go, there will be people who say you're doing this to get something from my family. Compensation. Land. They'll find a way to make it look like it's about money. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I want you to know that when that happens, I'll say publicly and clearly what the arrangement between us actually is, what you're being paid, and why. I won't let them use our association to discredit you. I wasn't worried about that, she said. Which was not entirely true. She'd thought about it briefly the night before in the particular early morning hour, when every worry felt more real than it actually was. I know you weren't, he said. I wanted to say it anyway. She rode on without responding, but something in her chest shifted slightly, the way things shifted when you'd been carrying a weight alone for a long time, and someone stepped in to take one end of it. She didn't put a name to the feeling. She just let it sit. The trouble with the timber arrived properly the next morning when Calloway met her at the site gate with a look that told her it was worse than a misplaced delivery. Hicks is gone, he said. Cleared out overnight, and the timber I asked around. Greer's yard got a delivery yesterday afternoon. 40 board feet brought back by a man matching Hicks's description. Greer said the man told him there'd been an ordering error. Was there money exchanged? Greer gave him $8. So somebody had paid Hicks to pull material from the site and return it to the yard under a false pretense. Which meant somebody wanted to slow the build. Which connected in a direct and ugly line to Sterling's visit and Dowd's word pressure. She went through the accounts for the past 3 weeks with fresh eyes that morning, looking for anything she'd filed away as normal that might not be. She found 2 more irregularities, small ones, but deliberate. A materials order that had been delayed at the freight office for reasons never specified. A crew scheduling change that Calloway had attributed to weather, but that when she cross-referenced the weather records didn't match. By noon, she had it laid out in her ledger, not proof exactly, but a pattern. Someone was picking at the edges of the operation. Small enough to look like bad luck, large enough to cost time and money. The kind of interference that was designed to frustrate without leaving fingerprints. She showed it to Calder over the lunch hour. He read through it twice without speaking. Sterling's not doing this himself, he said. No, he doesn't have the connections to the supply chain. This is coming from someone with reach into the freight routes. She paused. Someone who knew which yard was supplying us, who the crew foreman was, what the delivery schedule looked like. That's information that would have to come from inside. Yes. She'd been sitting with that conclusion since mid-morning, and she didn't like it any more the 5th time she turned it over than the 1st. Hicks was the obvious piece, but Hicks didn't set this up alone. He's not smart enough, and he wasn't here long enough. Calder looked at her. Who had access to the full supplier list? Yumi Calloway and the freight clerk in Ridgeway. She paused. I trust Calloway. I've watched him for 3 weeks and his loyalties are straightforward. If he were compromised, he'd have found a more effective way to be useful to whoever was paying him. The freight clerk. His name is Burton, she said. He's been with the Ridgeway freight office for 6 years. But 6 years ago, I looked it up, the office changed ownership. The new owner is a man named Harold Crane, who has 3 documented business partnerships with railway contractors. She set down her pencil. 2 of those contractors have been under federal review for land acquisition fraud. Calder was very still. How did you find that? County records are public, she said. They just take time to read. He looked at her ledger and then at her face, and what was in his expression was something she'd seen in it before. That quality of assessment of recalibration, the moment when someone decided they had understood a thing correctly. You've been doing this since yesterday. Since this morning. I got back from Abilene at dusk yesterday, checked on Samuel and went to bed at a reasonable hour. She allowed herself a small pause. I'm not tireless, Mr. Rourke. I'm efficient. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but warm enough to be adjacent to one. He looked back at the ledger. What do we do about Burton? We route the next delivery through a different freight office. We don't tell Burton until the order is already in transit, which means he can't intercept it. She turned to the next page. We also need to hire replacement crew, but not through the same channels Calloway used for the Abilene group. I'd like to post notices in Ridgeway and one town further east. Smaller pool, more trackable. He was watching her with that steady attention of his. Anything else? Yes. She closed the ledger. I want to go to the Silver Creek land. He went still. Mara. Not to the mine, to the east shaft entry, the site of the collapse. She met his eyes. "I've never been. My mother wouldn't go, and after she died, there was no one to go with, and I—" She stopped. "I want to see it. Whatever's there." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll take you." They rode out the following Sunday, just the two of them. The Silver Creek land was east of the canyon, which meant they passed within a mile of the ranch site. On their way, she noted the progress of the foundation as they went by the clean lines of the posts, the beginning of something real. Then they rode past it, and the landscape grew more vertical, the rock cutting in on both sides as the trail narrowed. She'd never been this close. The mine itself was shuttered operations, had been suspended 2 years ago. She knew when the ore yield dropped below profitable, but the infrastructure was still there. The head frame above the main shaft. The equipment shed. The office building windows boarded. She didn't stop at any of those. She followed the trail Calder had mapped from the company records east along the canyon wall to where the secondary shaft had been sunk, the eastern tunnel system that the inspection reports had flagged. What was left of the entry was a depression in the ground and a tangle of collapsed timber and rusted iron fenced off with a simple post and rail barrier. She dismounted, walked to the fence, stood there. Calder stayed back. She was grateful for that, for his reading of the moment, for his understanding that this was not something that needed company. Her father had gone down through an entry, very like this one. She didn't know which shaft exactly, only that it was in the eastern tunnel system, only that the collapse had begun at the deepest point and moved outward. 11 men. She knew all their names. She had looked them all up, written them in the back of a journal she kept for no other purpose. Thomas Vance Roy Kettner, James Albee, Carl Munn, all 11 in her own handwriting, because she had decided that if no one else was going to keep their names somewhere permanent, she would. She stood at the fence for a long time without saying anything. The wind moved through the canyon. It was cold. She put both hands on the top rail of the fence and held on to it. Then she said low and clear, as if her father might be in the ground below her and might be able to hear, "I found it, Papa. It's going to take a while, but I found it." She stood there a moment more. Then she turned around and walked back to where Calder was standing with the horses. He looked at her face, and he didn't say anything, which was exactly right. They rode back toward the ranch in the late afternoon, and the silence between them was a different kind than it had been before, heavier but cleaner, the way a room felt after a window had been opened. She was not all right exactly. She wouldn't be all right for a long time, she suspected. But she was steady, which was what she knew how to be, and steady was enough. "Dowd sent a message this morning," Calder said when the ranch site came into view. "The federal office has acknowledged receipt of the filing. They've assigned a preliminary reviewer." She breathed in, breathed out. That's faster than he expected. He thinks the Frick documentation helped. A man tied to the inquiry board showing up on my father's payroll 2 weeks after the inquiry closed. That's not subtle. He paused. Dowd also said Sterling's name came up in the reviewer's first pass. Apparently Sterling had contracts with the Silver Creek operation, not just as a railroad supervisor, surveying contracts, land rights. She looked at him sharply. He had a financial stake. He did. Which means his harassment of the operation isn't just about protecting my father's reputation. He has his own exposure. Calder's voice was careful, measured the voice of a man delivering information he'd had a day to sit with. Dowd thinks Sterling may have been the one managing the inquiry board. My father provided the money and the connections. Sterling provided the local knowledge and the access. The picture assembled itself in her mind, piece by piece, the way ledger entries assembled into totals. Her father's death had not been an accident of circumstance. It had been an accident that was allowed to happen by men who had looked at the cost of fixing it and decided it was too high. And then those same men had spent 3 days in a courthouse managing the consequences. She had known this. She had not known the names. Now she did. "When this is done," she said, and she meant when it was fully done, when the federal office had made its determination and the families had their answer. "I want to go to each of the other 10 families, the ones who signed those papers in 1879. I know, he said. I'll go with you. She looked at him. At this man who had not caused what happened at Silver Creek, who had not been there, and not made those decisions, who had inherited them the way you inherited debt, without choosing it, without wanting it, but carrying it nonetheless. She thought about what Samuel had said, a man is not the same thing as his father. She thought about the way Calder had filed those records instead of burying them. The way he'd told her the truth instead of letting her find out another way. The way he'd stood beside her without speaking at that fenced-off hole in the canyon wall, and understood exactly what she needed in that moment. All right, she said. We'll go together. They rode the last mile to the site in the fading light, and the skeleton of the ranch rose around them. The posts and the framing, and the beginning of walls, something being built out of ground that had never had anything built on it. Mara looked at it and felt for the first time in a long time something that was neither grief nor anger nor the numb pragmatism she'd trained herself to operate on. It felt like the beginning of something. Not an ending. Not a resolution. Just the first real evidence that there was going to be a future and that she was going to be in it. She tied her horse and opened her ledger and got back to work. The federal letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late April, 6 weeks after Dowd had filed the formal complaint with the land office in Abilene. Mara was at the site when Calder rode in with it. She saw him coming from a distance. The particular pace of his horse told her something had happened. Not urgency exactly, but intention. The gait of a man carrying something that needed to be delivered. She set down her pencil and waited. He dismounted and handed her the envelope without preamble. She opened it, standing up the way she did everything, without ceremony, without delay. The federal office had completed its preliminary review. Based on the evidence submitted, the suppressed inspection reports the documented relationship between Aldous Frick and Edmund Rourke's mining interests, and the sworn statement of Mara Vance regarding the conduct of the 1879 inquiry. The office had determined that sufficient cause existed to open a formal reinvestigation into the Silver Creek collapse. A federal investigator would be appointed within 30 days. All parties with documented interest in the case would be notified. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. Mara. Calder's voice was quiet. I know. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not cry until there was something real to cry about. Not grief, not frustration, not the accumulated weight of 4 years of carrying something she couldn't put down. She'd been waiting for something solid. Something that meant it had mattered, all of it, the counting and the fighting and the choosing not to let go. This was solid. It's not over, she said. No, it's not. The reinvestigation could take months. They may not find everything. The formal conclusion... Mara. He said her name the way he had that first night in the livery, when he told her the truth about his family. Quietly, finally. The word that stopped the calculation for a moment and asked her to just be in the room with what was happening. Let yourself have this one for a minute. She looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about her father's name written in the back of her journal in her own careful handwriting. She thought about the other 10 names beside it. She let herself have it for 1 minute. Maybe 2. Then she put the letter in her coat pocket and picked up her pencil. I want to ride out to the Kettner place this weekend, she said. Roy Kettner's wife, her name is Elsa. She's been living on her sister's property in Cedar Falls since the collapse. I looked her up. She paused. I want her to hear it in person, from someone who was there. Saturday, Calder said. I'll ride with you. They had been building for 3 months now, and what had started as posts and framing was beginning to look like something you could live in, something permanent and real. The main house was framed and partially sided. The bunkhouse for the crew was finished. The supply barn was roofed. Callaway had brought on 4 new crew members through the Ridgeway postings, all vetted, all solid, none of them connected to Sterling or to the freight clerk in Ridgeway, whose name they'd passed along to Dowd, along with everything else. Sterling himself had gone quiet since the federal letter was filed. Mara had heard through the reliable transmission network of Red Hollow gossip that he'd hired a lawyer in Abilene. She'd heard also that he'd been seen twice at the telegraph office, sending long messages to destinations nobody in town could confirm. She watched these reports the way she watched her ledger carefully, without drawing conclusions before the evidence supported them. Samuel's treatment had finished its first full course the week before. Dr. Hale's assessment was careful but genuinely positive. The infection was responding. The progression had slowed, and if the next 6 weeks held, they could talk about Samuel doing limited physical work by summer. Samuel had received this news with the dry composure of someone who had trained himself not to hope too loudly. Mara had received it in Dr. Hale's office with her hands folded in her lap and her face neutral, and then walked 3 blocks to the edge of town where nobody could see her, and stood there for 4 minutes, doing absolutely nothing, which was the closest she had come to falling apart in months. She didn't tell Calder about the 4 minutes, but she told Samuel that evening sitting beside his bed, with the lamp low between them, and Samuel had looked at her with his 2 old eyes and said, "Good, you were overdue." The ride to Cedar Falls on Saturday took most of the morning. Elsa Kettner was a small woman in her 60s, with white hair and the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve herself, and when she opened the door and saw Mara, something crossed her face, recognition, even though they had never met. Recognition of the particular quality of a person who had been carrying the same weight. "You're Tom Vance's girl," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Elsa looked at Calder, looked back at Mara. "Come in," she said. They sat in Elsa's kitchen, and Mara told her everything. The inspection reports, Frick's name on Edmund Rourke's payroll, the federal reinvestigation. She told it plainly and completely the way she had told it to Dowd, without softening it and without dramatizing it. Elsa Kettner listened with her hands folded on the table and her eyes steady, and when Mara finished, the older woman was quiet for a long time. "I knew," Elsa said finally. "I knew it wasn't what they said." Roy was careful. 20 years underground and not one serious accident. He knew every weakness in that tunnel system. He wouldn't have been in the eastern shaft if he thought it was going to come down. She paused. But knowing and being able to do anything about it are 2 different things. "Yes," Mara said. "They are." "What happens now?" "The federal investigator comes within 30 days. They'll want statements from the families. It won't be fast, and I can't promise you a particular outcome. But the evidence is filed, and it's real, and it's not going to disappear this time." She looked at Elsa steadily. "Roy's name is in my journal, all 11 names. I've been keeping them since my mother signed those papers in 1879. I wanted someone to keep them." Elsa reached across the table and put her hand over Mara's. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They visited 3 more families on the way back. The Munn family in Ridgeway, a son of James Albee, who was now running a small farm east of town, and an elderly woman named Clara Hess, whose husband had been the oldest man in the Eastern Shaft crew, 63 years old, 3 years from retirement. Each conversation was different in its particulars, and the same in its essential shape: the long-held knowledge that something had been wrong, the resignation that had set in when no one came to confirm it, and the very particular expression that crossed each face when Mara told them someone was finally coming to ask the right questions. She held herself together through every one of those conversations. She was good at that. She had been good at that since she was 15 years old. It was on the ride back in the last hour of the afternoon, with the sun going flat and golden behind them, that she finally said out loud the thing she had been thinking for weeks. "I want to buy into the ranch." Calder turned to look at her. "Not a gift, not as part of my wages. A real stake purchased at fair market value once the operation is profitable enough to price it." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I've been running this thing since the beginning. I know every account, every supplier, every decision that's been made about this land. I want to own part of what I've built." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wondering when you'd ask." She looked at him sharply. "I've been thinking about it for a month," he said, "trying to figure out how to bring it up without you thinking it was charity." It's not charity if I buy in. I know that. He paused. 20% at assessed value payable from future profits over 3 years. No interest. He looked at her. Is that fair? 25%, she said. Same terms. He held her gaze for a moment. 25%, he said. Same terms. She looked back at the road. Something settled in her chest. Not relief exactly, but the deep structural solidity of a thing that had been properly built, like the first wall of a house going up plumb and true. All right, she said. Sterling made his last move on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after their ride to Cedar Falls. He came not to the site this time, but to Dr. Hale's office where he sat in the waiting room, until the doctor had a moment, and then he told Dr. Hale in the careful language of someone who had rehearsed it, that he was aware of certain irregularities in the financial arrangements surrounding the Vance boys' treatment, and that should the federal inquiry proceed in certain directions, questions might arise about the propriety of a medical professional accepting payment from a party with a vested interest in the case. Dr. Hale listened to this without expression. Then he stood up, opened his office door, and said, Mr. Sterling, if you come to my office again for any purpose other than your own medical care, I will report this conversation to the federal investigator by name and in full detail. Good afternoon. Mara heard about this from Dr. Hale himself, who told her with the particular satisfaction of a careful man who had done something he was proud of. She thanked him. He waved her off. That man has been a blight on this county for 15 years, he said. I should have said something sooner. She went back to the site and found Calloway and told him to double the crew at the gate for the next 2 weeks because Sterling was getting desperate, and desperate men made poor decisions. Calloway nodded and got it done without any fuss, which was one of the things she valued most about him. The federal investigator arrived on a Wednesday in May, a week ahead of schedule. His name was Graves, and he was nothing like Dowd, where Dowd was compact and still. Graves was tall and angular and asked his questions with the rapid, precise energy of a man who had a great many of them, and not enough hours in the day. He interviewed Mara for 3 hours in the hotel in Abilene, going through every document she had, asking her to walk him through the logic of each connection she'd made between Sterling's contracts and the inquiry board, between Frick's appointment and the suppressed reports. She walked him through all of it, slowly, clearly, with the evidence in the right order. Her father had taught her that numbers told the truth if you put them in the right order. The same was true of facts. When she finished, Graves sat back and looked at her with an expression she recognized as professional respect. You built most of this case yourself, he said. The records built it, she said. I just read them. Most people wouldn't have known what to read. My father taught me to read ledgers, she said. He told me numbers don't lie. I figured the same applied to everything else that got written down. Graves looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook, closed it, and stood up. I'll need you available for follow-up questions over the next several weeks. Don't go anywhere. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I'm building a ranch. The formal finding came in early July. Mara was in the main house when Calder brought the letter she was measuring the interior walls for shelving a purely practical task that she had been looking forward to for weeks, because it meant the walls were finished enough to put things on them. She climbed down from the step stool and took the envelope and opened it. The federal investigation had concluded that the 1879 inquiry into the Silver Creek collapse had been materially compromised by undisclosed financial relationships between members of the inquiry board and parties with direct interest in the outcome. The inspection reports, suppressed by the Silver Creek operations management, had been entered into the federal record. Formal charges had been referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office regarding Jack Sterling's role in the management of the inquiry board. The 11 families affected by the collapse would be contacted regarding remediation proceedings. Edmund Rourke's name was in the letter. Not as a defendant, the man had 3 months to live at most, and Graves had told Mara privately that pursuing criminal charges against a dying man was not where the federal office would spend its resources. But his name was in the record now. What he had allowed to happen was in the record. It would not be erased. Sterling was another matter. Sterling was 54 years old and in full health and had known exactly what he was doing in 1879 and had continued to do it every day since, right up to the visit to Dr. Hale's office. Mara did not feel sorry for what was coming to him. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and held it in both hands. "It's not everything," Calder said. He was leaning against the doorframe watching her. "Edmund won't face charges. The remediation process will be slow. Some of the families may not get what they deserve." "I know." She looked at the letter. "But their names are in the federal record now. Roy Kettner, James Albee, Carl Munn, Thomas Vance." She looked up. "All 11 of them, in the official record of what happened. That doesn't go away." She set the letter down on the workbench. She picked up her measuring tape. She looked at Calder, who was still in the doorway with an expression on his face she had learned over these months to read with some accuracy, something careful and warm, and trying not to be too obvious about itself. "The east wall needs 3 shelves," she said. "Come hold the tape." He came and held the tape. They measured the wall together, her calling the numbers and him marking them, and the house was quiet around them, and smelled like new wood, and the particular clean air of open country. And outside, she could hear Calloway directing the crew on something. And further away, the sound of Samuel's voice. He'd been coming out to the site 2 afternoons a week, color in his face, now something restored in him that she had been afraid was gone for good. She marked the last measurement, put the pencil behind her ear, looked at the wall. "Calder," she said. "Yeah." She turned to look at him. He was closer than the task had required, or maybe the task had simply been an excuse for proximity the way tasks sometimes were. She had been aware of this for a while. She suspected he had been aware of it longer. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "The part that isn't practical." "I know, and I don't know how to do it without turning it into something I can put in a ledger." "You don't have to put it anywhere," he said. "It can just be what it is." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had told her the truth when lying would have been easier. Who had signed the contract without argument and paid for Samuel's treatment before she'd earned a single day of wages. Who had stood behind her without speaking at a fenced-off shaft in a canyon wall and understood exactly what silence was for. Who had ridden with her to 4 separate farms and sat in 4 separate kitchens and listened to 4 families grieve and never once treated that as anything other than the most important thing they had done all year. She put her hand on his arm. Just that. Just her hand. His hand came up and covered hers, and he held it there without pressing, without pulling, without making it into more than what it was, which was 2 people who had built something together, standing in the thing they had built. "All right," she said. "It can just be what it is." Outside the ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres that had never had anything built on it, and now did. The foundation was solid. The walls were plumb. The crew was paid fairly, fed well, and treated as men who did real work deserving of real regard. The accounts were clean and accurate, and accounted for every dollar down to the last cent, because Mara Vance ran the books, and Mara Vance did not permit inaccuracy. And in the federal record in Abilene, 11 names sat in permanent ink in an official document finally placed where they had always belonged, in the truth, where nothing and no one could touch them. Thomas Vance had taught his daughter that numbers didn't lie. That the most honest thing a person could do was look at what the record said and not flinch from it. That the truth put in the right order would hold. He had been right. He had always been right. And his daughter, who had counted her tips and her losses and her debts and her grief for 4 years without letting any of it stop her, had just proven it, not for herself. Not only for herself, but for every name in that journal she kept in her coat pocket, written in careful handwriting by a girl who had decided at 15 years old that if no one else was going to keep those names, she would. She had kept them. She had carried them to the place where they would be kept forever. She was done counting now. She was done surviving. Mara Vance, 25% owner of the Rourke Vance Ranch, manager of operations, keeper of accounts, daughter of Thomas Vance, was finally fully and without apology ready to live.